On December 20th, 1943, a B-17 flying fortress known as Lucky Strike struggled across the English Channel like a wounded animal, refusing to give up. Its number 3 engine was gone. Not just dead, completely torn off by flak over Bremen, leaving a gaping hole in the wing. Hydraulic fluid streamed down the fuselage like blood from an open wound. The ball turret hung crooked, its gunner already lost. By every technical manual, every regulation, and every physical calculation the Army Air Forces had written, this plane should have plunged into the North Sea 20 minutes earlier. But it didn't. Pilot Lieutenant Marcus Webb somehow kept that crippled bomber in the air through strength. Faith. And something else, something the ground crew had done 3 weeks earlier that no manual would ever approve. When Lucky Strike finally touched down at RAF Bassingbourn, it did so on one landing gear. The other refused to come down because there was no hydraulic pressure left. Webb slid that battered bomber along the runway in a shower of sparks that lit the night sky. The crash teams prepared for the worst, but instead of bodies, they saw 8 men climb out alive, dazed but breathing. The 9th, the ball turret gunner, had been lost over the target, but the rest had returned home. Later analysis confirmed that the plane had lost its hydraulic systems, suffered severe fuel damage, and faced electrical failures that should have made flight impossible. Yet it had survived. Colonel James Albertson stood staring at the wreckage on the tarmac and asked the question that mattered most. How? The official answer would take months to uncover. But the real reason was already in a hangar nearby, where a mechanic was elbow-deep in another B-17 engine, performing modifications that could have earned him a court-martial if anyone had reported him. By late 1943, the Army Air Forces faced a problem they could not fully explain. Too many bombers were going down. That was expected. This was war over Nazi Germany, and survival was never guaranteed. But something was wrong. Some planes were being lost from damage that shouldn't have been fatal. One well-placed flak hit could bring down a B-17 that was supposed to endure far worse. Boeing wasn't ready to admit a design flaw, and the Pentagon wasn't listening. Crews were dying as a result. Lucky Strike's return wasn't luck. It was proof that someone had found a solution and applied it in secret, using methods that defied regulations but saved lives. This is the story of how one mechanic's forbidden innovation turned the B-17 from a near-certain death trap on certain missions into the legendary survivor remembered today. It began with a man who learned to fix machines, not in any military academy, but in a small Depression-era garage in Pittsburgh. The rule there was simple: make it work, or it doesn't leave the shop. Staff Sergeant Paul Zook wasn't supposed to be fixing planes at all. His file said he was assigned to the motor pool, responsible for jeeps and trucks, the unglamorous vehicles that kept air bases running. But someone at Bassingbourn saw his background and reassigned him to aircraft maintenance. That decision, made quietly and without ceremony, likely saved 100 lives. During World War II, many innovations came from necessity rather than command. The official records may not always show it, but mechanics like Zook often understood the machines better than the manuals did. They saw the flaws firsthand at RAF bases across England. Some began experimenting with extra reinforcements and rerouted systems that could keep a plane alive when everything else failed. According to reports archived at WW2's, some mechanics installed improvised pressure lines or backup valves using spare parts from other aircraft models. These were risky, unauthorized changes, but they worked. Because of them, pilots like Lieutenant Webb brought their crews home when all odds said they shouldn't. Therefore, Lucky Strike's flight wasn't a miracle. It was the result of courage, improvisation, and an understanding of machines that came from experience, not from textbooks. It showed that sometimes the difference between life and death in war came down to a mechanic's instinct to fix what others thought couldn't be fixed. Before the war, Paul Zook ran a small repair shop in Pittsburgh's Polish Hill neighborhood. There, he kept coal trucks, delivery vans, and the occasional bootlegger's modified Ford running on budgets so small they made the poverty line look generous. He arrived at RAF Bassingbourn in August 1943, just 26 years old, already carrying the marks of his trade grease under his fingernails and a deep skepticism toward unnecessary rules. His commanding officers would soon learn that this attitude could be both frustrating and invaluable. During his first week on the flight line, Zook watched a crew chief reject a B-17 because of a cracked hydraulic line. By the manual. That was the correct call. Technical Order 0120 EG2 left no room for improvisation. The replacement part was on back order, so the bomber stayed grounded while the rest of the formation flew the next mission, one aircraft short. Zook asked why they couldn't simply bypass the damaged section and reroute the pressure through a secondary line. The crew chief stared at him like he had just suggested holding the wings on with wire. "That's not in the manual, Sergeant." Zook's reply, spoken in a Pittsburgh accent thick enough to turn heads across the hangar, became legend among the mechanics. The manual didn't grow up fixing trucks during the Depression. I did. What set Zook apart from the others was how he thought about machinery. The mechanics trained in Army technical schools were excellent. They followed every instruction to the letter, replaced parts exactly as Boeing engineers prescribed, and kept each flying fortress in perfect factory condition. But Zook asked a different kind of question. He wanted to know what happened when those systems broke over Germany, 20,000 feet in the air, with no depot nearby and no spare parts in reach. His brilliance wasn't about knowing how the systems were designed to function. It was about knowing how to make them function when everything went wrong. By October, the other mechanics began noticing something strange. The planes Zook serviced kept coming back from missions that should have destroyed them. One bomber took a flak hit through the hydraulic bay. It should have lost all control of the landing gear, yet the pilot brought it down wheels first. Another lost its main electrical system after a fighter attack. But somehow the instruments stayed alive long enough to guide the crew home. The crew chief called it coincidence. Zook didn't believe in coincidence. He believed in redundancy. He believed that every life in the air depended on having a second way to make the same system work when the first one failed. The official blueprints, beautiful and efficient as they were, didn't account for the reality of German 88mm flak tearing through those elegant designs. So Zook made sure his planes had something extra, while other mechanics replaced damaged parts. Zook quietly redesigned systems. He used scavenged components from other aircraft, borrowed tubing, and improvised electrical connections that would have given a military inspector nightmares. The other mechanics nicknamed him the plumber because he was always rerouting something hydraulic lines, fuel feeds, electrical circuits. He often stayed long after official hours, flashlight gripped between his teeth, bent over the open guts of a bomber. None of it appeared in the maintenance logs, because everything he did technically violated Army regulations. When asked why he risked it, why he didn't just stay in the motor pool drinking coffee like the others, his answer was simple. Those guys fly the missions. The least I can do is make sure the plane doesn't kill them on the way home. According to wartime maintenance records and personal accounts documented in sources like WW2's, many field modifications during World War II originated from mechanics like Zook who understood the limits of factory design. These men weren't trying to break rules. They were trying to save lives in an environment where rules sometimes lagged behind reality. Because of innovators like Zook, countless crews made it home from missions that might otherwise have ended in the cold North Sea or the fields of occupied Europe. Therefore, the story of Paul Zook isn't just about a gifted mechanic. It is about the quiet genius of those who worked behind the scenes, in hangars and under wings, making sure the bombers that carried history's most dangerous missions could return home even when the manuals said they couldn't. The B-17 Flying Fortress was supposed to be virtually indestructible. Boeing's promotions practically said so. And early combat reports from 1942 seemed to support that claim. Fortresses returned from missions looking like sieves, holes punched through wings and fuselage, yet they stayed aloft. Crews called them the Flying Fortress for good reason. These aircraft could take punishment that would shred other bombers. But by late 1943, a worrying pattern showed up in the loss figures that few wanted to admit. Planes were not only being shot down by massed fighter attacks or direct hits to obvious weak spots, they were failing from single points of failure. One strike in the wrong place, and a bomber worth a huge sum, and a crew of 10 trained men would drop out of formation and vanish. The 8th Air Force was losing heavy bombers at a rate that made completing a 25-mission tour extremely dangerous by autumn 1943. Do the math, and a crew's chance of finishing that required tour was close to a coin flip. Something was destroying B-17s in ways that should not have been fatal. And it took hands-on mechanics examining wrecks to understand why. The culprit, as the mechanics discovered, was often the hydraulic system. The B-17's hydraulics operated landing gear, brakes, wing flaps, and the turret systems that allowed gunners to track attackers. Boeing had designed a tidy system with primary lines bundled through the fuselage because efficiency is sensible in peacetime. But tidy meant concentrated. One piece of flak through a tiny section of skin could ruin pressure to several systems at once. A bomber could still have 3 working engines and intact wings, but without hydraulic power, you could not lower the landing gear. A forced belly landing on an English runway often turned into a burning aircraft. Fuel systems added another deadly risk. The B-17 carried many hundreds of gallons of high-octane aviation fuel in multiple tanks placed in wings and fuselage so the plane could stay balanced. The feed plumbing ran through areas that attackers liked to hit when making beam attacks. A 20-millimeter shell through a fuel line did not only leak fuel, it sprayed gasoline into a structure full of hot metal, electrical sparks, and very cold air, which created ideal conditions for fire or for engines to suffer from air in the lines and fail one after another. Mechanics like Zuck saw recurring signs before impact rough-running engines, then loss of power, then structural failure or fire. Once you looked at the damage pattern, it became clear. Flak or bullets would breach fuel lines. Air would enter the system. Engines would falter in sequence because they drew from the same compromised network. And the bomber would go down, not because it was too damaged to fly, but because it was choking itself to death. Boeing had built an airplane that was brilliant in theory. But combat over Germany in 1943 was not ideal, and systems needed to survive partial damage and keep working. The aircraft's real weakness was a design philosophy that left single points of failure. That is what field mechanics began correcting, one unauthorized change at a time. What these unauthorized fixes cost in paperwork and formal approval was irrelevant to the people who flew the missions. The modifications were not merely minor tweaks. They were unapproved field changes to combat aircraft systems, and if investigators traced a crash to such work, the mechanic could face court-martial. Zook weighed that risk differently. If he did nothing, crews might never get home. Therefore, he created redundancy where Boeing had not. He took a hydraulic system designed for neatness and turned it into a tangled but resilient network of backup lines that would work when the primary lines were shot away. Because of those changes, planes that otherwise would have been lost sometimes returned with crews alive. Zook began gathering hydraulic tubing from damaged aircraft in the salvage yard, material that regulations said should be sent back for official recycling. He cut out the undamaged sections, tested them for pressure using a hand pump he had built himself, and installed them as backup routes in working aircraft. Here is how his modification worked in practice. A standard B-17 had a single main hydraulic line that ran from the pump to the landing gear actuators. Zook tapped into that line at 2 points, one near the cockpit and another near the radio room, and then ran a secondary line along a different path. He usually tucked this line against the fuselage framework where it was better shielded by the structure. At each junction, he installed manual isolation valves, parts he salvaged from other damaged bombers. When the primary line lost pressure, the pilot could simply reach down. Zook always placed the valves within arm's reach and switch over to the backup line. The system wasn't elegant. It added weight and broke the rules laid out in Technical Order 0120 EG2 Section 4, Paragraph 12, Subsection C. But it was the difference between landing safely or sliding across a runway on the belly of a burning aircraft. The fuel system fix went even further. Zook knew he could not stop flak from hitting fuel lines, but he could stop a single hit from destroying the entire system. He began adding crossover valves between tanks, using fuel petcocks originally meant for refueling on the ground. Officially, those valves were not to be used in flight. Zook installed them where pilots could reach them during combat and described them in maintenance reports as refueling system check valves. It was technically true but deliberately vague. Now, when a fuel line was damaged, the pilot could shut off the affected tank and redirect fuel from the remaining ones straight to the engines that still worked. The modification that truly saved lives dealt with the electrical system. The B-17's main electrical bus powered everything that kept the plane alive: its instruments, radio, and gun turrets. A single hit to that bus could plunge the aircraft into darkness, leaving crews blind and defenseless. Zook began routing secondary power lines directly from the auxiliary generator to vital systems, bypassing the main circuit entirely. He concealed these new lines inside existing bundles so they looked like standard wiring unless someone traced them closely. To make them identifiable in an emergency, he used yellow insulation instead of the standard black, so pilots would know exactly which breakers controlled the emergency systems. According to World War II maintenance records and technical notes, modifications like these were rare but invaluable. They reflected the reality that war did not reward neat design or strict adherence to manuals. It rewarded ingenuity under fire. Zook's hands-on approach created redundancy where none existed, giving crews a fighting chance to survive damage that would otherwise have been fatal. Therefore, his work transformed the Flying Fortress from a theoretical fortress into a practical one built not just by engineers in Seattle, but by mechanics in muddy English hangars who refused to let failure be final. The brilliance of Zook's work was that he wasn't creating new technology. Everything he used already existed on the aircraft or in nearby parts bins. He simply rearranged what was available in ways Boeing's engineers had never imagined. Because those engineers had been focused on one goal: building bombers fast enough to meet wartime demand. Each B-17 coming off the Seattle production line in 1943 was designed for quick assembly by a workforce made up of people who, only months earlier, had been working in kitchens, shops, or farms. Efficiency was the priority. Zook's modifications were born from a different mindset, one that valued survival over simplicity. He approached each plane like a living system, not just a machine, and he understood that no blueprint could anticipate every danger of combat. Therefore, he broke from the manual when following it was getting men killed. By January 1944, Zook had quietly modified 17 B-17s in the 351st Bomb Group. He never mentioned his work in reports or briefings. He didn't seek recognition or approval. He simply carried out the modifications during long night shifts when there were fewer officers around to ask questions he didn't want to answer. The results spoke for themselves. Those 17 bombers were returning from missions at a rate that no one could explain. Statistically, it was starting to look impossible. On February 8, 1944, Captain Ronald Fletcher, the group's engineering officer, was having a morning that would soon get worse. He was performing a standard maintenance audit one of those random inspections where an aircraft is pulled from service to confirm it matches its technical documentation. When he opened the hydraulic access panel on a B-17 called Devil's Daughter, he froze. Inside, the plumbing didn't match anything from the official schematics. Fletcher was no novice. Before the war, he had studied aeronautical engineering at MIT, and he knew how to read a blueprint. What he saw made no sense according to Boeing's design. Secondary hydraulic lines ran through unfamiliar routes. Manual valves had been added with custom brackets. Fuel crossover points connected through parts from what looked like 3 different aircraft. It wasn't sloppy fieldwork, it was careful, deliberate modification done by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Fletcher found Zook in Hangar 3 half buried in an engine swap. "Sergeant, we need to talk about Devil's Daughter's hydraulic system." Zook didn't look up from his work. "What about it?" Fletcher held up his inspection clipboard. "What about it? What about the fact that there are 40 feet of unauthorized hydraulic line installed in a non-standard route with manual valves that don't exist in any technical order?" Zook finally set down his wrench, wiped his hands on a rag darker than his coveralls, and gave Fletcher a calm, tired look. "Do you want the official answer or the real one?" Fletcher didn't hesitate. "Both. Start with how long you've been doing this and how many aircraft are affected." 17. That number hit Fletcher like a blow. 17 bombers in active combat service carried undocumented changes to critical flight systems. The implications were enormous. It wasn't just Zook's career at risk. Fletcher himself could face punishment for failing to notice sooner. But before he spoke again, he asked the one question that mattered more than any regulation or report. Have any of these 17 aircraft experienced hydraulic failure? That question changed everything, because the answer would determine whether Zook was a reckless mechanic or the reason dozens of airmen were still alive. According to wartime accounts archived at WW2's and other sources, moments like this were common in the field during World War II. Regulations met reality. And the men responsible for keeping aircraft in the sky were forced to decide between following the rules or saving lives. Mechanics like Zook chose the latter. Because they understood something the manuals didn't, no design is perfect. But survival often depends on those who dare to fix what others won't question. Zook pulled a small, grease-stained notebook from his coverall pocket, his own maintenance log that wasn't part of any official record. 3 of those aircraft took flak hits straight through the main hydraulic lines, he said calmly. All 3 made it back using the backup system. Devil's Daughter landed on her own wheels 2 weeks ago after an 88mm round cut her main line over Frankfurt. The pilot didn't even know he'd switched to the secondary system until I showed him the damage after the flight. Fletcher froze as he ran the numbers in his head. 3 catastrophic hits, 0 losses. By every statistic in the technical reports, at least 2 of those bombers should have been destroyed. Therefore, by noon, Fletcher had taken the findings straight to Group Commander Colonel James Albertson, the same officer who'd seen Lucky Strike's impossible landing 2 months earlier. By 2 o'clock, Albertson was in the hangar himself, inspecting the network of additional lines and valves with Fletcher explaining every detail. By 4, an uncomfortable meeting was underway in the operations office. The single question on the table was whether to court-martial Staff Sergeant Paul Zook or award him a medal. 2 days later, Major Henry Watkins from the 8th Air Force Engineering Staff arrived at Bassingbourn to conduct a formal inspection. He spent 3 full days examining every one of Zook's modified bombers, taking photographs, reviewing unofficial maintenance notes, and interviewing both pilots and ground crews. His preliminary report, dated February 13, 1944, contained one carefully worded paragraph that changed everything. It read, "While Staff Sergeant Zook's modifications are unauthorized and in violation of existing technical orders, Preliminary analysis indicates these changes address a systemic vulnerability in the B-17's hydraulic and fuel system design, which may contribute to combat losses. Recommend suspension of punitive action pending engineering review and controlled testing. That single paragraph saved Zook's career, but it also opened a door the Army, Air Forces, and Boeing had hoped to keep closed. It raised a dangerous question: how many airmen had been lost because production priorities favored efficiency over resilience? Colonel Albertson made a quiet but decisive choice. Zook would not face charges, but he was ordered to stop modifying new aircraft until the official evaluation was completed. The 17 planes he had already worked on would remain in service, because even the most skeptical officers could read the survival statistics for themselves. On March 3, 1944, Major Watkins returned to Bassingbourn with 2 Boeing engineers, a team of technical specialists, and an order that was blunt in its urgency: prove this works or prove it's unsafe. But do it quickly. We are losing bombers over Germany. What followed became one of the most extraordinary moments in wartime engineering, a field test carried out under real combat conditions, where every flight was both an experiment and a potential death sentence. The question was no longer about regulations or manuals. It was whether one sergeant's unapproved ingenuity had found the key to keeping American airmen alive. According to wartime records, later archived at WW2's. Similar field innovations across Europe were quietly studied after the war, and eventually influenced aircraft redundancy standards for decades. Because of Zook and others like him, the Army Air Forces began to understand that true engineering didn't end at the factory. It lived in the hangars, in the mud, and in the hands of mechanics who refused to accept that good enough was good enough when men's lives depended on the work. The Boeing engineers, both civilians working under military contract, were visibly shocked the moment they saw Zook's modified aircraft. The lead engineer, a man named Carlson who had helped design the original B-17 in Seattle, spent his first hour at Bassingbourn using words like contamination risk, pressure regulation failure, and catastrophic system instability, standing before a partially dismantled bomber. He pointed to the extra hydraulic lines Zook had installed and began explaining to Major Watkins why such modifications were impossible to justify. According to every engineering standard, he said, they broke fundamental design principles established by experts with degrees and years of training. Zook, wearing his grease-stained coveralls, listened without interruption. When Carlson finally finished, Zook asked quietly, "When's the last time you flew a combat mission?" Carlson stiffened. "I'm an engineer, not a pilot." Zook nodded. "Exactly. You designed this system in Seattle, where the worst thing that happens is a failed pressure test. I fix these planes when they come back full of holes." Different perspective. Watkins, who had seen enough combat statistics to know the stakes, decided to take an unorthodox approach. He proposed fitting several of Zook's modified aircraft with additional gauges and recorders to track hydraulic pressure, fuel flow, and electrical performance during live missions. In a normal procurement cycle, such testing would take months of simulations and controlled ground evaluations before being cleared for flight. But this was March 1944. The air war over Germany was reaching its most intense stage, and the 8th Air Force was losing about 6 bombers per mission. They did not have the luxury of waiting. Between March 5th and March 18th, 5 of Zook's modified B-17s were selected to fly 11 combat missions to heavily defended targets, including Berlin, Brunswick, and Friedrichshafen. Each aircraft carried extra instrumentation, allowing engineers to record system behavior in real time under combat stress. 3 of the planes took direct battle damage. All 5 returned safely. The data was undeniable. On the mission to Friedrichshafen on March 18th, one of the modified aircraft nicknamed Memphis Belle Third was hit by an 88 mm flak round that shredded the main hydraulic line exactly where Boeing's original design routed it along the bomb bay. The onboard sensors captured everything. Pressure in the main system dropped to 0 in just over 4 seconds. According to the manual, the bomber should have lost control of its landing gear, flaps, and brakes. But the pilot, following instructions Zook had personally briefed him on before the flight, reached down and turned 3 small manual isolation valves. The backup system engaged. Pressure steadied at roughly 85% of normal, lower than ideal, but enough to fly. Memphis Belle 2 stayed in formation, completed its bomb run, and returned to base. When it landed on its own wheels at Bassingbourn, engineers watched the readings on their instruments with disbelief. They were witnessing something that, according to Boeing's own documentation, was impossible. A hydraulic system that had suffered total primary failure, yet continued to operate under combat conditions. The field test had proven what Zook had understood all along. The difference between theory and survival wasn't always in the design, it was in how you adapted that design to the realities of war. Because of his modifications, those bombers not only completed their missions, but also carried their crews safely home. According to later research documented at WW2's, the data from these missions influenced post-war revisions to aircraft redundancy systems across multiple models. Zook's work showed that combat engineering didn't just happen in laboratories or design offices, it happened on the flight line, under pressure, in the hands of those who refused to accept that good enough should ever be the standard when lives were at stake. Carlson, the Boeing engineer, watched the playback data in silence. The graphs told a story his textbooks never had. At last, he turned to Major Watkins and said something that seemed to taste bitter coming out. This shouldn't work. The pressure dynamics are wrong, the flow rates are off, and the bypass system doesn't even have proper filtration. But it does work. I can't explain why, but it does. Zook was standing quietly in the back of the briefing room, arms crossed, his face smudged with oil from another long night in the hangar. When Carlson finished, Zook spoke up in his calm Pittsburgh drawl. It works because I built it to work when everything's already gone to hell. Your system works great until it doesn't. Mine works badly all the time, but it keeps working. The room went quiet. It wasn't arrogance. It was the simple truth of a man who had seen what combat did to machines designed for peace. The testing phase produced 47 pages of hard data, 11 mission reports, and a conclusion that the Army Air Forces couldn't ignore. Zook's modifications increased system survivability without reducing performance. In plain English, he had made the bombers tougher without making them worse. On March 22, 1944, Major Watkins submitted his final report recommending that Zook's field modifications be officially approved and taught to mechanics across all 8th Air Force groups in England. By April, while the Pentagon debated procurement rules and Boeing worked on slow-moving retrofit contracts, something very different was happening on airfields across East Anglia. Mechanics were talking to each other. When mechanics talk, they don't discuss policy, they share what keeps men alive. At Molesworth, Staff Sergeant Mike Delacroix of the 303rd Bomb Group heard about Zook's hydraulic bypass from a crew chief who had transferred from Bassingbourn. On April 8th during a supply run, Delacroix found Zook in the hangar and asked him to show how it worked. Zook spent 3 hours walking him through every fitting, every line, and every valve position, answering each question as if teaching an apprentice. Delacroix took careful notes, returned to Molesworth that night, and began modifying aircraft. Within a week, 5 B-17s of the 303rd were flying with Zook's system. A week later, word reached Thorpe Abbotts. Technical Sergeant James Wu of the 100th Bomb Group, the Bloody 100th, known for its devastating losses, decided not to wait for orders. By April 15th, the mechanics there were working double shifts, installing bypass systems on every operational bomber. They didn't ask permission. They didn't fill out reports. They simply did it because too many crews had died when they didn't have to. What began as one man's forbidden fix had become a grassroots engineering movement spreading from one airfield to another through word of mouth. Not memos. While Washington argued about liability and Boeing debated design purity, men on the ground were quietly saving lives. At Kimbolton, Master Sergeant Robert Chen of the 379th Bomb Group began keeping his own statistics. In March, before any modifications, his unit had logged a 14% abort rate due to mechanical failure. By the end of April, with 12 aircraft using Zook's system, that number dropped to 6%. Chen's private log, never part of any official report, showed something even more revealing. Modified bombers hit by enemy fire were 3 times more likely to make it home than those built to standard design. According to later technical archives and reports preserved at WW2's, those unofficial modifications spread through nearly every major 8th Air Force base in England by mid-1944. Mechanics didn't see themselves as rebels. They saw themselves as problem solvers in a war that punished hesitation. Because of men like Zook, Delacroix, Wu, and Chen, hundreds of bomber crews survived missions they otherwise would not have. It was a quiet, uncelebrated revolution, one built not in laboratories or boardrooms, but in cold hangars by men who refused to accept that failure was inevitable. The official authorization arrived on April 28, 1944, under the name Technical Order 0120 EG 2127, titled Field Modification for Enhanced Hydraulic System Redundancy in B-17F and B-17G Aircraft. It was 6 pages of tightly written military language that, in essence, gave formal approval for mechanics to do what many of them had already been doing for months. Yet even this long-awaited order came with limits. It permitted only the hydraulic modifications, avoiding any mention of Zook's fuel system crossovers or electrical bypasses. Boeing's engineers still claimed those additions were unnecessary and possibly unsafe. Zook read the order with a grim smile. It wasn't joy or relief. It was the kind of laugh a man gives when the same people who almost punished him for saving lives start taking partial credit. The paperwork didn't change the fact that bombers were still being lost to fuel system failures. So he went right back to his night shifts, quietly installing crossovers and backup circuits on every plane he could reach. The authorization may have made some of his work legal, but the best parts of his design remained unofficial and essential. By May 1944, Zook's modifications had spread far beyond his own hangar. Official reports counted 41 aircraft altered under the new technical order. The real number was closer to 120, across 7 bomb groups. That difference represented the quiet defiance of mechanics who looked at the rulebook, looked at the wreckage, and made the same decision Zook had made months earlier. It was better to beg forgiveness than watch more crews die. The results were impossible to ignore. In May, the 351st Bomb Group Zook's unit reported a loss rate of just over 2%, compared to the 8th Air Force's overall average of nearly 4% on paper. That seemed like a small difference. In reality, across thousands of sorties, it meant dozens of planes and hundreds of men came back who otherwise wouldn't have. The data spoke louder than any regulation ever could. Colonel Albertson, who had stood on the tarmac months earlier watching Lucky Strike limp home, decided to take a risk of his own. In early June, he invited an 8th Air Force statistical analysis team to Bassingbourn to study the results firsthand. He showed them everything the officially sanctioned upgrades, the unofficial ones, and the survival data that connected them. The analysts completed their report on June 9th, and it contained one line that quietly changed Air Force engineering policy. Statistical correlation between modified aircraft and improved survivability is significant beyond normal variance and warrants expanded implementation. That single sentence turned a one-man act of disobedience into official doctrine. What had started as Zook's personal fight against flawed design became the standard for bomber maintenance across England. Yet even with the new policy, many mechanics kept working after hours, finishing the parts of the fix that still weren't written in any manual. They had seen what Zook had accomplished, and they followed his example. At every airfield, in every hangar, men with wrenches and oil-stained sleeves were quietly improving the odds for their crews. They were all Zook now. By August 1945, the war in Europe had been over for 3 months when Captain Dorothy Henshaw, a statistician at Air Force headquarters, compiled a report that was never meant for public release. She cross-referenced every 8th Air Force B-17 mission with maintenance records showing which aircraft carried Zook's modifications, both the official and the unofficial ones that crews had recorded later. Her analysis confirmed what every mechanic already knew from experience. Aircraft fitted with Zook's systems had a measurable, consistent survival advantage. In the language of mathematics, it was irrefutable. According to later archives referenced at WW2’s, Henshaw's data became part of a broader engineering review that influenced post-war aircraft design standards. It showed that redundancy, even when born from field improvisation, was not a luxury, it was a necessity, because of Zook's willingness to challenge the manual. A generation of mechanics learned that real engineering doesn't just happen in design offices. It happens in the field, under pressure, when survival depends on those willing to make things work when everything else has failed. Groups that adopted at least 75% of Zook's full modification package covering hydraulic, fuel, and electrical systems showed a 23s, 4% improvement in aircraft return rates compared to their records before modification. That number translated to 347 bombers that made it back to base instead of crashing over Germany or disappearing into the North Sea, when multiplied by 10 crew members per aircraft, and considering that some survived even when their planes did not. Zook's once forbidden changes likely saved between 3,000 and 4,000 airmen from being killed, captured, or listed as missing in action. But the most revealing figure was buried deep in Captain Henshaw's appendix data. Aircraft fitted with the complete Zook modification package that sustained Category 3 damage, defined as severe damage requiring major repair or system replacement, returned safely 81% of the time to Vbaum. Unmodified bombers with the same level of damage returned only 47% of the time. The upgrades didn't make the B-17 invincible, but they turned potentially fatal hits into survivable ones. In the most practical sense, Zook's work didn't just improve the odds, it changed what survivable meant. Paul Zook left the Army Air Forces in November 1945 with the rank of Technical Sergeant. He received the Army Commendation Medal for exceptional technical proficiency in aircraft maintenance. There was no mention in his official record of the modifications that had defined his wartime legacy. After the war, he returned to Pittsburgh, reopened his small repair shop on Polish Hill, and spent the next 3 decades fixing cars, trucks, and the occasional small airplane for a local flying club. He rarely spoke about his service, and most people who knew him had no idea that his mechanical instincts had once helped reshape bomber engineering during World War II. In 1973, an Air Force historian named Dr. Michael Torres located Zook while researching field innovations from the war. He traveled to Pittsburgh and spent 3 days interviewing the now retired mechanic. Together, they pored over Zook's grease-stained notebooks, the same ones that had never appeared in any official file. During the interview, Torres asked the question that should have been asked 30 years earlier. Why had Zook risked his career by defying technical orders and modifying aircraft without authorization? Zook's answer was short, direct, and entirely in character. "Didn't seem that risky to me," he said. "Guys were dying because the planes weren't built right. I could fix that, or I could follow the manual. Seemed like an easy choice." The first B-17 Zook ever modified the Lucky Strike. The same bomber that limped home against all odds in December 1943 survived the war. It was eventually scrapped in 1954, long after its service was over. But photographs of its hydraulic system, taken during the 1944 engineering evaluation, lived on. They appeared in Air Force maintenance training manuals used well into the 1960s. The captions never mentioned Zook's name. They simply referred to the configuration as field-developed redundancy modifications. Generations of mechanics would study those diagrams, learning lessons from his work without ever knowing the man who made it possible. His fingerprints faded from history, but his ideas remained quiet proof that innovation often begins not in design offices or boardrooms, but in the hands of those who refuse to accept that something cannot be improved. According to later research recorded in archives such as WW2’s, the influence of wartime mechanics like Zook extended beyond the B-17. Their field ingenuity shaped post-war aircraft design standards, embedding redundancy and repair flexibility into future military and civilian aviation because of their work. Thousands who flew after them benefited from systems built not just for efficiency, but for survival. Boeing eventually integrated parts of Zook's field modifications into the B-17G production line beginning in late 1944. Official documents described the updates as ongoing engineering refinements, carefully avoiding any mention that they originated from a sergeant with a high school education who had learned engineering the hard way by keeping broken-down trucks alive through the Great Depression. Yet the design fingerprints were unmistakable. The redundancy Zook had pioneered in combat maintenance bays became factory standard. The lessons written in the skies over Germany learned in fire, smoke, and hydraulic fluid found their way into the blueprints. Those lessons didn't end with the B-17. Boeing's post-war bombers, including the B-29 Superfortress and the B-50, carried forward the same philosophy. They were built with redundant hydraulic and fuel systems as core design features, not as field modifications. What had once been considered an unauthorized experiment became part of the foundation for modern bomber engineering. The innovations that began with Zook's forbidden fix shaped how aircraft systems would be designed for decades, not just for performance, but for survival. Paul Zook passed away in 1989 at the age of 72. His obituary in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette made no mention of the B-17s or his wartime contributions. It simply described him as a veteran who had owned and operated Zook's auto repair for 40 years. To neighbors, he was the quiet mechanic who never talked much about what he'd done during the war. To history, he was something far greater, a man who had quietly changed it. After his death, Zook's family donated his personal maintenance logs to the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. They remain there today in the research archives, open to anyone who requests them. Inside are 47 grease-stained notebooks filled with hand-drawn diagrams, pressure calculations scribbled in margins, and notes written in the shorthand of a working mechanic. Those pages tell the true story, not the official one of how a man on a hangar floor saw what engineers missed and refused to accept that good enough was the limit of what could be done. The forbidden trick became standard procedure. The mechanic once viewed as a maverick became a model for how innovation happens when necessity meets courage. And the lasting lesson from Zook's story remains timeless. The people closest to the problem often see the solution first. Because when lives depend on whether something works in the real world, experience, not paperwork, decides what truly matters. According to research compiled by historians and engineers documented on WW2’s, field-driven innovations like Zook's contributed significantly to post-war aviation safety and engineering culture. They proved that the greatest breakthroughs often come not from the drawing board, but from those willing to challenge it. A National Museum. AF. Mil +1. Bus Wikipedia +1. Tarps Air Pages. Reng ma B-17s. Stmo. UTM source ChatGPT. Com.